Imagine a story so shocking, so twisted, that it was buried in whispers for over a century. In the heart of 19th century Alabama, a scandal unfolded that shattered the laws of society, morality, and power. A widow consumed by greed and vengeance, a forced marriage that defied every rule, and a secret so dark it could only be paid for in blood. Buckle up, because today we're diving into a forgotten chapter of American history that will leave you speechless. Hit that subscribe button and let's unravel the chilling tale of the Hawthorne Plantation. In 1850, in the sweltering depths of Baldwin County, Alabama, the Hawthorne Plantation became the epicenter of a scandal so unthinkable it was barely spoken above a whisper. It began, as most Southern tragedies do, with a death. Jeremiah Hawthorne, a man whose quiet authority was felt in every corner of his vast cotton empire, was found dead in his study, a glass of whiskey still resting on the desk beside him. The official cause was a sudden heart attack, a story as polished as the manicured lawns of his estate. But the enslaved people who worked the house, who saw everything and said nothing, knew the truth lived in the eyes of his widow, Eliza, before Jeremiah's body was even cold. Eliza began a transformation that horrified all who witnessed it. Once a celebrated beauty, the darling of mobile society, she began to consume. She ate with a desperate, insatiable hunger, her body swelling until she was a monstrous parody of her former self. Her grief, if it was grief at all, took the form of flesh. She became a prisoner in her own mansion, a grotesque queen ruling from a reinforced throne-like chair, her dominion shrinking to what she could see from her window. But her ambition, her cruelty, only grew. And it was this ambition that led her to make a decision so utterly unthinkable, it felt like a crack in reality itself. She announced that her frail, sickly daughter, Abigail, would be married, and the groom she had chosen was her late husband's favorite slave, a man named Caleb. Can you even begin to imagine the silence that followed that decree? The absolute suffocating stillness in the grand dining hall, where Eliza, picking at a whole roasted pig with her bare hands, made the announcement. This wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It was a violation of the sacred laws that held their world together, the law of God, the law of man, the brutal arithmetic of property and ownership. Abigail, her daughter, was a pale, bird-like creature of 19, perpetually clutching a handkerchief to her mouth to stifle a cough that seemed to come from her very soul. She was seen as a failure, unfit to carry the Hawthorne name, too weak to secure a powerful alliance through a proper marriage. But this was not a solution. It was a damnation. And then there was Caleb. He wasn't just any field hand. Jeremiah Hawthorne had trusted him, confided in him, and, in a secret buried with him, had taught the man to read and write. Caleb carried himself with a quiet dignity that infuriated other white landowners. He understood the plantation's ledgers better than the overseer. He knew the land, the cycles of the seasons, the whispered histories of the families, both black and white. Jeremiah had called him his shadow, his conscience. To Eliza, this made him the most dangerous man on the plantation. He was a living repository of her husband's secrets. Forcing him to marry her daughter wasn't an act of madness. It was a calculated move in a terrifying game only she understood. It was a way to own him, to consume him, to bind Jeremiah's last secret to her own corrupted legacy, ensuring it could never be used against her. She was not just creating a marriage, she was forging a chain around a ghost. The whispers about Eliza were already legendary. They said her insatiable hunger began the night Jeremiah died. A house servant, a young girl named Lila, swore she saw Eliza in the pantry after the doctor had left, cramming fistfuls of raw sugar into her mouth, her face smeared with a sweetness that looked like madness. The story was dismissed as the fantasy of a frightened girl. But as weeks turned into months, the evidence became undeniable. Her body became a fortress of flesh, a physical manifestation of her gluttony for power. She had to have her chairs reinforced, her doorways widened. Her movements became a monumental effort, each step a tremor through the floorboards. But her mind remained terrifyingly sharp. She saw everything. She knew who was whispering. She knew who pitied her daughter. and she knew that Caleb, with his intelligent eyes and quiet composure, was a judgment against her. He was a walking, breathing reminder of the man her husband was and the monster she was becoming. The forced marriage was her masterpiece of cruelty. It was designed to shatter 3 people at once. It would humiliate her daughter, proving to the world that Abigail was worth no more than a slave. It would break Caleb's spirit, tethering his pride to the sickbed of a girl he could never love, making him a prisoner not in the fields, but in the master's house itself. And most importantly, it would desecrate the memory of her husband, Jeremiah. It was a message to the grave. The man you valued, the secrets you kept, I will twist them into an abomination. I will own everything you ever touched, and I will make it ugly. You're not supposed to know this, but this wasn't just about the Hawthorne plantation. This was a test, a dark experiment, and there were others watching. To understand Caleb, you have to understand the man who owned him, Jeremiah Hawthorne. Jeremiah was a contradiction, a man who profited from a brutal system while privately despising it. He had inherited the plantation, inherited the sin, and wore it like a tailored coat that was a size too small. His relationship with Caleb was his one act of rebellion. He saw in the young boy a mind too sharp to be wasted on picking cotton. The lesson started in secret, late at night in the study where Jeremiah would later die. They read the classics, Plato, Shakespeare, the Bible, Jeremiah's finger tracing the words, Caleb's voice giving them life in a hushed whisper. It was a dangerous, illegal, and deeply profound connection. Jeremiah didn't see a slave. He saw a mind, a soul. He taught Caleb not just to read words, but to read people, to understand the intricate dance of power and fear that defined their world. Caleb learned to manage the plantation's accounts, rotate crops, negotiate with suppliers in Mobile, all under the guise of being Jeremiah's personal valet. He was, in every practical sense, the master of the plantation's success, while the world only saw him as the master's property. When Jeremiah died, Caleb lost more than an owner. He lost his protector, his mentor, his only friend. He knew Eliza hated him. She saw the bond he shared with her husband as a betrayal. She couldn't comprehend a connection based on intellect and respect. She could only see it through her own lens of possession and jealousy. Now, standing before her, hearing her decree, Caleb understood this marriage wasn't a punishment. It was an erasure. She wanted to bury the man Jeremiah had created inside the shell of a husband to a sickly white girl, to trap his mind in a domestic prison from which there could be no escape. Abigail Hawthorne existed in a state of perpetual apology. She was sorry for her cough, sorry for her weakness, sorry for not possessing the vibrant beauty her mother had once flaunted. Her life was a series of closed doors and shaded rooms. Her only companions were the novels she was allowed to read, and the constant, suffocating presence of her mother's disappointment. She had loved her father, Jeremiah, with a quiet desperation. He was the only one who didn't look at her with pity or frustration. He would sit by her bed and read to her for hours, his calm voice a balm against the anxious energy of the house. He never demanded she be stronger or prettier. He only asked that she be kind. When he died, the last buffer between Abigail and her mother's cold ambition was gone. Eliza's cruelty, once veiled in southern pleasantries, became direct and suffocating. She saw Abigail's illness not as a tragedy, but as a personal insult, another failure of the Hawthorne bloodline. This forced marriage to Caleb was the ultimate expression of that contempt. Abigail had seen Caleb around the estate, of course. She knew him as her father's shadow, a figure of quiet competence who moved with a purpose that seemed at odds with his station. She was afraid of him, not because he was a slave, but because he was a man, and she had been taught to fear everything. Now, this man, this stranger, was to be her husband. She was to be handed over to him like a deed of land, another piece of property in a transaction she couldn't comprehend. In her mother's eyes, this was her true worth. She was a broken vessel, fit only to be filled with the seed of a slave in a grotesque effort to... what? Abigail didn't know. She just knew that the walls of her room, which had once felt like a sanctuary, were now closing in, and they were beginning to feel exactly like the walls of a tomb. A quote from a traveler's diary penned in Alabama in 1848 reads, The Southern planter class lives in a state of perpetual veiled warfare. They smile at dinners and toast to each other's health, all while maneuvering to destroy one another. Their truest secrets are not matters of finance but of blood, for they know that legacy is the only currency that truly endures. Eliza understood this better than anyone. The wedding was to be held in the family chapel at dusk. It wasn't a real chapel but a small, musty outbuilding Jeremiah had built for his wife in a futile attempt to appease her performative piety. It had been unused for years. Now it was being prepared for a sacrilege. Eliza decreed that all house slaves would attend. They were to be the witnesses, the congregation for her blasphemy. This was a crucial part of the ritual. Their presence would legitimize the act, their forced silence a testament to her absolute power. They would see Caleb, one of their own, elevated and simultaneously destroyed. They would see the master's daughter, a symbol of their untouchable world, brought low. The message was clear. There are no rules but mine. I am the God of this place, and I can reshape reality to my will. For Caleb, the walk to the chapel was the longest of his life. He was dressed in one of Jeremiah's old suits, the fine wool a suffocating mockery. He could feel the eyes of his people on him, a mixture of fear, pity, and a terrible unspoken question. Why? He had no answer. As he stood at the makeshift altar watching the door, he thought of Jeremiah's lessons. Power is a story, his master had told him once. Whoever controls the story controls the truth. Eliza was telling a new story now, a story of corruption and dominance written in the ink of broken taboos, and he and Abigail were the unwilling protagonists, trapped in a narrative that could only end in ruin. The chapel smelled of dust and decay, a scent that clung to the damp, oppressive air. Eliza had ordered it filled with wilting magnolias, their cloying sweetness a sickening perfume that did little to mask the rot. She presided over the ceremony from a massive throne-like chair dragged from the main house, her bulk overflowing its sides. She was dressed in black silk, a grotesque parody of a grieving widow, her face powdered white, a painted smile fixed on her lips. Abigail was led in by the overseer, a brutish man named Holt, whose hand on her arm looked more like a shackle. She was a ghost in a simple white dress, her face as pale as the fabric, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen her voice. She didn't look at Caleb. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze was fixed on a point in the middle distance, as if she had already departed her own body. A disgraced preacher, a man from a nearby town who had lost his church to drink and debt, was paid a handsome sum to mumble the words. He slurred the sacred rites, his eyes darting nervously toward Eliza, then to the armed overseer Holt. He spoke of union, of flesh becoming one, but the words were hollow, obscene in this context. The house slaves stood packed in the back, their faces impassive masks. But their collective fear and horror was a palpable force in the room. This was a violation of their world too. It was a twisting of the natural order that promised nothing but chaos and suffering. When the preacher asked Caleb, "Do you take this woman?" all eyes fell on him. The air crackled with tension. A single word of defiance would mean a slow, agonizing death. He could feel Holt's hand move closer to the pistol on his hip. He looked at Abigail, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a white mistress, but a fellow prisoner, a child being sacrificed. His voice, when it came, was a low, steady whisper that seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. "I do." After the ceremony, there was no celebration. There was only a quiet, dreadful procession back to the main house. Abigail was escorted to the master bedroom, Jeremiah and Eliza's former room, which had been prepared for them. Her own small, familiar bedroom had been locked, another cage dismantled, a new one built. Caleb was made to follow. As he stepped across the threshold, the two house slaves who stood guard pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place was like a gunshot. The room was vast and opulent, dominated by a four-poster bed large enough to sleep a family. Eliza's scent, a suffocating mix of lavender powder and sickness, still clung to the linens. The air was thick with the ghosts of a dead marriage and a living nightmare. Abigail had retreated to the farthest corner of the room by the window, wrapping her arms around herself as if to keep from shattering. She was trembling, her shallow breaths visible in the dim candlelight. They were alone, husband and wife, master and slave, prisoner and prisoner. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, filled with the unspoken horror of their situation. Caleb knew what was expected of him. He knew the consummation of this grotesque union was the final seal on Eliza's victory. It was the part of his degradation she would savor most, imagining it from her room down the hall. But looking at the terrified girl by the window, he felt not lust, but a profound and weary sadness. He was not an animal. He would not be made into one. He walked over to a chaise lounge near the fireplace, as far from the bed as he could get. "You are safe," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I will not touch you. We will lie to her. We must survive this." Abigail finally looked at him, her eyes clouded with confusion and fear. It was the first act of defiance, the first secret they would share against the monster who ruled their lives. The next morning, Eliza summoned Caleb to her private sitting room. She was reclined on a daybed, a mountain of silk and lace, a tray of untouched breakfast cooling beside her. The pretense of eating was over. Her true nourishment was control. She didn't ask about the wedding night. She stated, "The girl is now your responsibility, her health, her compliance. You will ensure she produces an heir for the Hawthorne estate within the year. A son." The words were delivered with a cold, clinical precision that turned Caleb's blood to ice. An heir. This was the purpose of the charade. This wasn't just about humiliation or control. It was about blood. But why? Why this blood? Why this unholy mixture that would create a child who belonged to two worlds and to none? It made no sense. "You will not work the fields," Eliza continued, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. "You will be her keeper. You will not leave her side. Every breath she takes, you will witness. Every meal she eats, you will serve. She is your only task. Do you understand the honor I am bestowing upon you?" It was an honor as a hangman's noose is an honor. He was being made a jailer, and his prison was the master bedroom. His prisoner, the sickly child who was now his wife. He was to be her shadow, a constant living reminder of her disgrace and his own. As he left the room, he saw the overseer, Holt, smiling, a cruel, knowing smile. The entire plantation was watching. They were all part of this theater of cruelty. Caleb realized his life was no longer about survival in the physical sense. He had entered a psychological labyrinth, a battle of wills against a woman whose madness was matched only by her cunning. And the prize in this twisted game was the life of his unborn, unconceived child, and the soul of the girl locked in the room upstairs. The days that followed bled into a monotonous, suffocating routine. Caleb and Abigail existed in the gilded cage of the master bedroom, their lives orchestrated by the whims of the monster down the hall. Meals were brought to them on silver trays, but they ate separately in silence. Caleb would sleep on the chaise lounge, Abigail in the massive bed, a silent pact of distance between them. Their conversations were brief, whispered, and fraught with the terror of being overheard. The house was not empty, it was filled with ears. Servants moved silently through the halls, their expressions carefully blank. But Caleb knew they were listening, reporting every detail back to Eliza. She wanted to know everything. Did they speak? Did they argue? Did they touch? He and Abigail constructed a careful fiction. For the benefit of the servants, they would speak in low, neutral tones about the weather or the books Abigail was reading. But in the dead of night, when the house was finally still, they would talk in earnest. "Why did she do this?" Abigail would whisper from the darkness of her bed. "Why us?" And Caleb, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, would answer honestly, "I don't know. But I believe it has something to do with your father." He began to see that beneath Abigail's frail exterior was a sharp, inquisitive mind, a mind that her father had nurtured. She knew things about the house, about her mother, about the secrets tucked away in hidden drawers and locked cabinets. She told him about her father's study, how Eliza had sealed it the day he died, forbidding anyone from entering. She fears that room, Abigail whispered. There is something in there she doesn't want found. It was a breadcrumb, the first tangible clue in the suffocating mystery of their lives. The study held a secret, and whatever it was the key to understanding Eliza's madness, and just maybe the key to their escape. A historical rumor passed down through generations of Alabama slaves spoke of ghost bloods, children born of secret unions between master and slave, who were used to settle land disputes or secure inheritances through loopholes in the law. These children were said to be cursed, belonging neither to the field nor the house, their existence a secret that could only be paid for in blood. This chilling folklore began to haunt Caleb's thoughts. The demand for an heir, it wasn't rational. A mixed-race child could not legally inherit the Hawthorne plantation. Such a child would be a pariah, a living scandal. So why was Eliza so insistent? Unless the law was not the point, unless the point was something older, something more primal. As the weeks wore on, Caleb began a dangerous game of observation and deduction. He watched Eliza. He listened to the servants' gossip. He paid attention to the visitors who came to the house, lawyers, businessmen, distant cousins. They all treated Eliza with a mixture of fear and a strange conspiratorial deference. They spoke in code, referring to the arrangement and the continuation of the line. It was clear this was not a secret confined to the Hawthorne estate. Others knew. Others were complicit. He also watched Abigail. He saw the toll this ordeal was taking on her. Her cough worsened, and she grew paler, more translucent. But he also saw a flicker of defiance growing in her eyes. The more her mother tried to crush her, the more a quiet strength, her father's strength, began to emerge. One night, she pressed a small, cold object into his hand. It was a key. "It's for the study," she whispered, her breath catching in her chest. "My father gave me a copy long ago. My mother doesn't know. We have to see what's in there." It was an incredible risk. If they were caught, Eliza's punishment would be biblical, but it was also their only hope. The truth was locked behind that door, and they were the only two people left alive who had a reason to find it. The opportunity came during a brutal summer storm that shook the very foundations of the mansion. The wind howled like a grieving spirit, and rain lashed against the windows, masking any sound they might make. Eliza, who was terrified of thunderstorms, had sequestered herself in the cellar, attended by two of her most trusted servants. The rest of the house was quiet. The staff huddled in the kitchen, too frightened to move. It was now or never. Moving through the darkened halls of the Hawthorne mansion felt like navigating a mausoleum. Every portrait on the wall seemed to watch them, their painted eyes full of judgment. Every creak of the floorboards was a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The study door was at the end of the west wing, a part of the house that had been left to dust and shadows. Caleb slid the key into the lock. The click of the tumblers turning was deafening. The room was just as Abigail had described it, frozen in time. A half-finished glass of whiskey sat on the desk. A book lay open, its pages yellowing. The air was stale, thick with the scent of leather, tobacco, and something else. Grief. It felt like walking into Jeremiah Hawthorne's last breath. They had to be quick. Abigail went to the bookshelf, her small hands running along the spines of her father's favorite volumes, searching for anything out of place. Caleb went to the desk. He pulled open the drawers, his heart pounding against his ribs. Account books, land deeds, business correspondence, nothing. It was all maddeningly normal. Then he felt it, a small notch on the underside of the main drawer. He pressed it, and a hidden compartment, no bigger than a Bible, sprang open with a soft sigh. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a single sealed envelope addressed not to Eliza, not to a lawyer, but to Caleb himself. The name was written in Jeremiah Hawthorne's elegant, familiar script. His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. This was it, the reason for everything. The secret that had cost Jeremiah his life, and had condemned them to this living hell. The letter began without preamble, the words a desperate confession from beyond the grave. "Caleb, if you are reading this, it means my courage has failed me and Eliza has succeeded. She has poisoned me, not with a substance, but with a truth she unearthed. a truth she has used as a weapon to destroy me and to seize control of my legacy. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. Poisoned. Jeremiah hadn't died of a weak heart. He had been murdered by his wife. The letter went on to explain the impossible. Decades ago, before Jeremiah's father had built the Hawthorne empire, he had made a pact with the 5 other founding families of the county. It was a dark covenant, a secret society designed to ensure their power would remain absolute and uncontested for generations. They called themselves the Crescent Order. The pact had a bizarre and terrifying clause. If any family's legitimate bloodline was in danger of ending, they were bound by the covenant to produce an heir through a vessel of the land, a chosen slave, to ensure the continuation of the family's control over the territory. The child would be raised as a distant ward or an adopted nephew, their true parentage a secret known only to the order. It was a way to cheat death, to cheat fate, to ensure their dynasties never fell. Jeremiah, to his horror, had discovered that his own father had invoked the pact. He himself, Jeremiah Hawthorne, the master of the plantation, was the son of his grandfather and an enslaved woman. His entire identity was a lie, a secret that gave the Crescent Order, and now Eliza, power over him. She had found proof of his true parentage and had used it to blackmail him, to break him, to drive him to a death of despair. Can you imagine the horror of that revelation? Your entire life, your name, your power, all built on a foundation of lies and forbidden blood. Abigail, who had been frantically searching her father's journal, let out a small, choked gasp. She held the book open, her finger pointing to a passage dated just a week before Jeremiah's death. The entry was a frantic, desperate scrawl. She knows. Eliza found the letters from the order. She delights in my humiliation. She says Abigail is weak, a dead end for the Hawthorne line. She plans to invoke the pact herself. She will use Caleb. She says it is justice, a way to purify the family line by blending it back into the soil it came from. She is mad. This is not about legacy. It is a perversion, an act of supreme vengeance against me and my true blood. She will create a monster to spite a ghost. It all clicked into place. The pieces of the puzzle formed a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Eliza wasn't trying to create a legal heir. She was fulfilling the dark rites of a secret society. She was using Caleb, a man her husband had loved like a son, to create a child that would satisfy the twisted rules of the Crescent Order, solidifying her control over the Hawthorne fortune and her position within this shadow elite. Abigail was not just a pawn. She was the ritual vessel. Caleb was not just a groom. He was the chosen sacrifice. The child they were supposed to create would be a living symbol of Eliza's ultimate victory over her dead husband, a ghost blood born of vengeance, bound to a legacy of secrets and lies. They were trapped not just by the laws of Alabama, but by a conspiracy that ran deeper than the law itself, a hidden power structure built on a foundation of unspeakable acts. The storm outside raged, but it was nothing compared to the tempest of horror that had just been unleashed inside that room. Their predicament was infinitely worse than they had ever imagined. The sound of a floorboard creaking in the hall outside the study door shattered the moment. They froze, the letter and journal clutched in their hands. The lock on the study door began to rattle. Someone was trying to get in. It was Holt, the overseer. He had been sent by Eliza to check on the house. In a surge of adrenaline, Caleb shoved the letter and journal into his shirt. He pushed Abigail behind the heavy oak desk just as the door burst open. Holt stood there, a lantern held high, his piggish eyes scanning the room. Suspicion etched onto his brutish face. "What are you doing in here?" he snarled, his gaze falling on Caleb. "This room is forbidden." Caleb's mind raced. He needed a story, a plausible lie. He gestured to the open window which he had unlatched moments before. "The storm," Caleb said, his voice astonishingly calm. "The wind blew the window open. I heard it slam from the hall and came to secure it. Miss Abigail followed, worried about her father's books." It was a thin story, but Holt was a man of muscle, not intellect. He grunted, his eyes sweeping the room one last time. He saw nothing out of place, The desk, the chairs, the books, all appeared undisturbed. "Get back to your room," he ordered, his voice dripping with menace. "Both of you, now. The mistress will hear of this." They walked back through the darkened corridors, the overseer's heavy footsteps echoing behind them, a constant threat. They had the truth. They held the proof of Eliza's crimes, of the Crescent Order's existence, of the entire rotten conspiracy that governed their lives. But what good was it? They were prisoners. The truth was just another chain, heavier than all the others, because now they understood the true scale of the monster they were facing. It wasn't just one mad, obese widow. It was an entire class of them. A cabal of the powerful who operated by their own dark rules. And they had just broken into their cathedral. The next day, Eliza's punishment was subtle and psychological. She didn't have them whipped. She didn't separate them. Instead, she tightened the leash. 2 armed guards were posted outside their bedroom door at all times. Their meals were reduced to bread and water. All of Abigail's books were removed from the room. They were to be left with nothing but each other in the suffocating silence. Eliza wanted them to break. She wanted them to turn on each other. But she had underestimated them. In that shared moment of terror in the study, a bond had been forged. They were no longer just 2 prisoners. They were allies. They had a shared secret, a shared enemy. The silence Eliza imposed upon them became their sanctuary. They developed a language of gestures, of glances. They would sit for hours on opposite sides of the room, seemingly in sullen silence, while communicating entire conversations with their eyes. They began to plan. Not an escape of the body, but an escape of the truth. Caleb knew that the letter and the journal were their only weapons. He couldn't risk keeping them in the room. One night, under the pretense of being sick, he convinced a sympathetic house servant, the same young girl Lila who had seen Eliza in the pantry, to empty his chamber pot. Tucked inside a false bottom he had crafted from mud and straw was Jeremiah's journal. He whispered a single urgent instruction to the terrified girl. "Bury this by the oldest oak tree at the edge of the property and tell no one." It was a desperate gamble, trusting his life and the truth to a child. But Lila, who had her own reasons to hate the mistress, nodded silently and disappeared into the night. He kept the letter, the more damning and concise piece of evidence, on his person at all times, sewn into the lining of his waistcoat. He was now a walking time bomb. As autumn stained the leaves of the Alabama countryside in hues of red and gold, a visitor arrived at the plantation. He was a doctor from Mobile, a man named Carver, who was an old acquaintance of the Hawthorne family. He was also, as Caleb quickly discerned from his coded conversation with Eliza, a member of the Crescent Order. He had come to check on the arrangement. Dr. Carver insisted on examining Abigail. It was a terrifying ordeal. He was a cold, clinical man with eyes that saw her not as a patient, but as a vessel, a piece of biological machinery that needed to be in working order. Caleb was forced to stand in the room and watch, his hands clenched into fists, rage and helplessness warring within him. After the examination, Carver spoke with Eliza in the dining hall, their voices low but audible through the slightly ajar door. "She is frail," Carver said. "Her constitution is weak. Are you certain she can carry a child to term?" Eliza's voice was sharp, cutting. "She will do what is required of her. The vessel is not important, only the blood it carries." The order agreed. The Hawthorne legacy must be secured. "And the father?" Carver pressed. "He is compliant?" "He is property," Eliza stated flatly. "He has no choice. He will perform his duty. And when the child is born and the succession is secure, he will be disposed of. An accident, a fever. These things happen." Caleb stood in the shadows of the hallway, the words washing over him like acid. Disposed of. He was a tool to be used and then discarded. And Abigail? What would happen to her once she had fulfilled her purpose? The answer was a chilling, unspoken certainty. She would be disposed of too. The doctor's visit was a catalyst. It shattered any illusion that they could simply wait out Eliza's tyranny. They had a timeline, and it was shortening with every passing day. Their purpose was to produce a child. And once that purpose was served, they were both dead. The pact they had made in silence, to feign intimacy, to lie to Eliza about the consummation of their marriage, was no longer just an act of defiance. It was their only means of survival. They had to continue the charade, to pretend they were trying to conceive a child, to buy themselves as much time as possible. But time for what? Escape seemed impossible. The plantation was a fortress, and even if they made it past the guards and the overseers, where would they go? A runaway slave and a white woman, they would be hunted down and killed within days. The law was not their ally. It was a weapon. No court in Alabama would listen to the testimony of a slave against his mistress, especially not when that mistress was a member of a powerful secret society that likely had judges and sheriffs in its pocket. Their only weapon was the truth contained in Jeremiah's letter. But a weapon is useless if you can't wield it. Caleb began to think not of escaping the plantation, but of getting the letter off it. He needed a messenger, a conduit to the outside world. He thought of the merchants who came to buy cotton, the traveling preachers, the distant neighbors. But who could be trusted? Who would be willing to risk their life to help a slave expose a conspiracy of the most powerful men in the state? The answer was no one. They were utterly, completely alone. The weight of this realization was crushing. They were trapped in a cage with a monster holding a key that fit no lock they could reach. It was Abigail who saw the path forward. Confined to her room, stripped of her books, she had turned her sharp mind inward, analyzing every memory, every conversation she had ever had with her father. He had friends in the north, she whispered to Caleb one night, her voice barely audible over the chirping of the crickets. Abolitionists. He called them his penitents. He corresponded with them in secret. He sent them money. He believed they were the only hope for the South to cleanse its soul. Jeremiah Hawthorne, a secret supporter of the very people his class despised. It was another layer to the man's complex, contradictory character. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, Abigail continued, her eyes shining with a feverish intensity, if I ever found myself in a danger I could not name, I was to send a message to a man named Ezekiel Stone in Boston. He said this man was a lawyer, a man of great courage and conviction. Ezekiel Stone. The name was a lifeline, a single point of light in an endless darkness. But how could they possibly get a message to Boston? The mail was monitored. Every letter that left the Hawthorne plantation was read by Eliza or her overseer. They were sealed in a tomb, and their voices could not escape. We don't have to send a letter, Abigail said, a hint of her father's cunning in her voice. We have to send a person. She was talking about Lila, the young house servant. It was a terrible burden to place on a child, to ask her to undertake a journey of hundreds of miles, fraught with danger, carrying a message that could get her killed. But they had no other choice. They were asking a child to save them because all the adults around them were monsters. Their plan was desperate, intricate, and relied on a dozen things going perfectly right. Abigail began to feign a dramatic decline in her health. Her coughing fits became more violent. She refused food, and she would lapse into long periods of seeming unconsciousness. She was a natural actress, her performance so convincing that even Caleb felt a pang of genuine fear. Eliza, enraged that her vessel was proving so defective, summoned Dr. Carver back from Mobile. This was part of the plan. They needed a distraction, a moment when all eyes were on Abigail to create an opportunity for Lila. While the doctor was in the house, the plantation's routine would be disrupted. Guards would be distracted. Attention would be focused on the drama unfolding in the master bedroom. Caleb, in his role as the concerned, dutiful keeper, would have slightly more freedom of movement. He would use it to get Lila away from the house. He wrote a condensed version of their story on a scrap of linen using a pen and ink he had managed to steal from a writing desk. He recounted the murder of Jeremiah, the existence of the Crescent Order, the forced marriage, and Eliza's plan for the heir. He sewed the scrap of linen, along with Jeremiah's original letter, into the hem of Lila's dress. He also gave her a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift Jeremiah had given him years ago. Show this to Ezekiel Stone, Caleb instructed the girl, his voice low and urgent. Tell him it comes from the shadow of Jeremiah Hawthorne. He will understand. He then told her a route to follow, a network of safe houses and sympathetic free blacks that Jeremiah had once described to him. A secret railroad running not to freedom, but to justice. He was sending a child into the jaws of a hostile world, armed with nothing but a secret and a prayer. Dr. Carver arrived in a flurry of self-importance. He examined Abigail, clucking his tongue and muttering about her weak constitution. Eliza stood over them, her massive form radiating impatience and fury. "Will she survive?" Eliza demanded, the question devoid of any human concern. "Will she carry the child?" "It is uncertain," Carver admitted. "Her lungs are weak. The strain of childbirth, it could kill her." Eliza's eyes narrowed. "Then we must be quick about it. The duty must be performed before the vessel breaks entirely." The cold, calculated cruelty of her words sent a chill down Caleb's spine. In that moment, while all attention was on the sickbed, Caleb slipped out of the room. He found Lila waiting by the servants' staircase, her eyes wide with fear. He knelt before her, taking her small hands in his. "You are braver than any soldier I have ever read about," he whispered. "What you do today may save us all. Go now. Don't look back. And may God walk with you." The little girl nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Then she turned and ran, a small shadow disappearing into the vastness of the night. Caleb returned to the bedroom just as Dr. Carver was leaving. He had been gone for less than 5 minutes. No one had noticed. The first part of the plan was complete. Lila was on her way. Now came the hardest part, waiting. They had to survive long enough for the message to reach Boston and for help to arrive. Weeks, months, they had no way of knowing. They had launched their only weapon into the darkness, and now they were disarmed, vulnerable, left to face the monster in her den with nothing but their courage and a desperate flickering hope. Lila's absence was discovered the next morning. A search was organized, but it was perfunctory. To Eliza, a runaway slave girl was an annoyance, a minor financial loss, nothing more. She had no reason to connect the girl's disappearance to the high-stakes drama playing out in her master bedroom. But the escape seemed to curdle her mood further. Her paranoia, always simmering beneath the surface, began to boil over. She trusted no one. She started taking her meals in her room, convinced the kitchen staff was trying to poison her. She had new locks installed on all the doors. The Hawthorne mansion, once a symbol of Southern grace, had become a fortress, a prison ruled by a mad queen. Her attention became obsessively focused on Caleb and Abigail. She began to suspect their lie. The consummation, the conception, it was taking too long. Her patience, a commodity she possessed in very small quantities, was wearing thin. She started making unannounced visits to their room in the middle of the night, bursting in with a lantern, her eyes scanning for any sign of their deception. Each time, Caleb would have to move from the chaise lounge to the bed, a frantic, silent scramble in the dark to maintain the fiction that they shared it. The psychological toll was immense. They lived on a razor's edge of constant fear. Sleep was a luxury they could no longer afford. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the hall was the sound of their doom approaching. Abigail's health genuinely began to fail under the strain. Her feigned illness was becoming real. She grew thinner, her cough more persistent. It was a race against time, but they were running in 2 different directions. They were trying to outrun Eliza's suspicion, while Abigail was losing her race against death. One night, Eliza came to their room, but she was not alone. She was accompanied by the overseer, Holt, who carried a coiled bullwhip in his hand. Eliza's face was a mask of cold, triumphant fury. "I grow tired of this charade," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "I have given you a task, a simple biological function, and you have failed me." She turned her gaze to Caleb. "Perhaps you require motivation. Mr. Holt will remain here tonight. He will ensure that you perform your husbandly duties. And if you refuse," she smiled, a horrifying twisting of her painted lips, "he will remind your wife, on her own skin, of the cost of disobedience." It was the ultimate violation, a forced, state-sanctioned rape with her brute as the witness. There was nowhere left to run, no lies left to tell. The charade was over. In that moment, something inside Abigail snapped. The frail, timid girl disappeared, and in her place was the daughter of Jeremiah Hawthorne, filled with a righteous fire. She rose from her bed, her small frame trembling, not with fear, but with rage. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the silent room. "You will not. You are a monster, and I will not let you make him one too." Eliza looked at her daughter with genuine surprise, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. Then she laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that shook her massive body. "Brave words, little bird, but they are just that, words. Mr. Holt, you may begin." Holt took a step forward, uncoiling the whip. But Caleb moved faster. He placed himself between Holt and the bed, shielding Abigail with his own body. He looked at Eliza, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost holy. "If you do this," he said, his voice low and steady, "you will get your heir. But I swear on your husband's grave, the child will be born an orphan." The threat hung in the air, audacious and absolute. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a declaration of war. He was promising to kill her. The sheer suicidal bravery of it gave even Eliza pause. She had expected fear, submission, begging. She had not expected a threat from a man who was, by every law of her world, less than human. She studied him, her sharp mind calculating the odds, weighing the variables. She saw the conviction in his eyes. He meant it. He would die, but he would take her with him, and she, for all her power, was a slow-moving, vulnerable target. Holt, the overseer, was a blunt instrument, not a bodyguard. "You think you can touch me?" she sneered, but the bravado in her voice was thin. "I am a slave," Caleb replied, never taking his eyes off her. "I have nothing to lose. You have an empire." For a long moment, no one moved. It was a standoff between a queen on her throne of flesh and a slave with nothing but his own life to wager. Abigail stood behind Caleb, her hand on his back, a silent show of solidarity that seemed to give him even greater strength. Finally, Eliza made a decision. She gave a short, sharp nod to Holt. "Leave us," she commanded. The overseer hesitated, then backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. Eliza stared at them, her expression unreadable. "You have spirit," she said, a strange, almost admiring tone in her voice. "Like him. Jeremiah saw it. That is why he favored you." She then did something utterly unexpected. She turned and left the room without another word. They were left in the sudden ringing silence, their hearts pounding. They had won. They had faced the monster and she had blinked. But they both knew it was not a victory. It was a temporary reprieve. She had retreated not because she was defeated, but because she was planning a new, more terrible form of attack. Eliza's new attack was psychological. She stopped visiting their room. She stopped sending her guards. Instead, she began a campaign of systematic cruelty against the other slaves. A field hand was whipped for looking at Caleb for a moment too long. The cook was denied rations because Abigail's food was not to Eliza's liking. Lila's mother was sold to a notoriously brutal plantation in the Mississippi Delta. Each punishment was delivered with a message, either explicitly or implicitly. "This is your fault. Their suffering is because of your defiance." It was a masterful, diabolical strategy. She was isolating them, turning their own people against them. The other slaves, who had once looked at Caleb with pity and respect, now averted their eyes. Their faces were a mixture of fear and resentment. He and Abigail were a curse on the plantation, their small rebellion causing a wave of suffering for everyone else. The guilt was a heavier burden than any whip. How could they hold on to their own humanity when it was being paid for with the flesh of others? Abigail began to waste away, consumed by a grief and guilt that was more potent than her physical illness. "We have to stop this," she would cry at night. "We have to give her what she wants." "No," Caleb would insist, his own resolve hardening even as his heart broke. "That is what she wants. She wants to break us. She wants us to surrender our souls. If we do that, then everyone has suffered for nothing." But he knew they were losing. Hope was a dwindling resource. They had heard no word from Boston. Lila was likely captured or dead. They were alone, and the monster was slowly, patiently, starving them of everything that mattered. hope, solidarity, and the will to fight. The breaking point came in late winter. A package arrived from Mobile, delivered by a messenger who rode a horse lathered in sweat. It was for Eliza. She opened it in the main hall in front of several house slaves. Inside was a small, exquisitely crafted baby's casket of polished mahogany. There was no note. There was nothing else, just the casket. It was a message from the Crescent Order, a warning. Her time was up. The arrangement had not been fulfilled. The other families were growing impatient. The Hawthorne legacy was still unsecured. That night, the temperature in the house dropped. Eliza's calculated cruelty was replaced by a frantic, unhinged desperation. She summoned Caleb to the dining hall. The room was dark, lit by a single candelabra that cast long, dancing shadows. Eliza sat at the head of the table, her massive form barely visible in the gloom. The tiny casket sat on the table in front of her. "The line must continue," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "The order demands it. Your sentimentality, your pathetic rebellion, it ends tonight." She gestured to the corner of the room. Holt, the overseer, stepped out of the shadows, but he was not alone. He held Abigail, a knife pressed to her throat. Her eyes were wide with terror. "You will give me what I am owed," Eliza hissed, "or I will gut this little bird right here on my dining room floor. The vessel is flawed, but her blood is still pure. The order will understand if I have to find another way. But you, Caleb, you will watch." It was the final, unthinkable checkmate. His life for hers, his soul for her survival. There was no choice. He had to surrender. He took a step forward, his body moving without his consent, a puppet whose strings were finally being cut. As Caleb moved toward them, a commotion erupted at the front of the house. Shouting, the sound of splintering wood as the front door was forced open. Holt turned, startled, his grip on Abigail loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Caleb needed. He lunged forward, not at Holt, but at the dining table. With a surge of adrenaline, he heaved the massive oak table onto its side, sending the candelabra and the tiny casket crashing to the floor. The room was plunged into darkness save for the flickering flames that were now licking at the dry linen tablecloth. Figures burst into the room, silhouetted against the moonlight flooding through the open doorway. They were white men, armed with pistols and rifles, their faces grim and determined. One man, tall and dressed in the severe black coat of a city lawyer, stepped forward, his voice booming through the chaos. "Eliza Hawthorne, my name is Ezekiel Stone. By the authority of the federal courts and the testimony of your husband, I am here to arrest you for murder, conspiracy, and the illegal bondage of a free man." Eliza stared, her mind unable to process what was happening. Her fortress had been breached. The outside world she had held at bay for so long had come crashing in. "Free man," she stammered. "He is my property." Ezekiel Stone held up a document, its official seal catching the light from the growing fire. According to the last will and testament of Jeremiah Hawthorne, the man known as Caleb was granted his freedom upon his master's death. "You have been holding a free man captive for nearly a year." It was the final secret, the one Jeremiah had never told Caleb himself. He had been a free man all along. Lila had made it. The brave little girl had walked and run and hidden her way to Boston. She had delivered the message. Hope had not died. It had just been a long time coming. Chaos erupted. The fire from the tablecloth spread quickly to the heavy drapes, flames climbing the walls like hungry beasts. Holt, seeing the armed men and realizing the game was over, released Abigail and made a dash for the back door, only to be tackled by one of Stone's men. Eliza, however, did not scream. She did not surrender. She simply sat amidst the flames and the smoke, a strange beatific smile on her face. "You are too late," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. "The order cannot be broken. It is older than your laws. It is in the blood, in the soil." She looked at Caleb, and her smile widened. "And it is in you." Her final words were a curse, a revelation that hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. "It is in you." Jeremiah had been the son of his grandfather, and a slave. Caleb, Jeremiah had loved him like a son, taught him, protected him. He was intelligent, dignified. He was Jeremiah's shadow. The impossible, horrifying truth dawned on him. He was not just Jeremiah's favorite slave. He was his son, his illegitimate, unacknowledged, enslaved son. The entire grotesque marriage, the demand for an heir, it had been Eliza's ultimate twisted act of vengeance. She was forcing Jeremiah's son to impregnate Jeremiah's daughter, creating a perfect, pure-blooded Hawthorne heir that would satisfy the Crescent Order's pact and desecrate every memory of the man she hated. She was not just continuing the line. She was purifying it, folding the secret bloodline back into the legitimate one in a perfect monstrous loop. The fire surged, engulfing the room in a wave of heat. Stone's men grabbed Caleb and Abigail, dragging them out of the inferno. As they stumbled out onto the lawn, they turned to look back at the house. The dining room was a furnace, and through the window, they could see Eliza, still seated at her table, laughing as the flames consumed her. She had lost everything, but in her mind, she had won the final victory. The Hawthorne plantation burned for 2 days. The fire erased the house, the chapel, the outbuildings, leaving only blackened chimneys pointing to the sky like skeletal fingers. It was a funeral pyre for a dynasty built on secrets. The aftermath was a messy, complicated affair. Ezekiel Stone's authority was challenged by the local sheriff, who was almost certainly in the pocket of the Crescent Order. But Stone had come prepared. He had federal marshals with him, and the evidence he carried, Jeremiah's letter, his will, and the detailed testimony Lila had provided, was undeniable. The Crescent Order, faced with exposure and a federal investigation, scattered. Some members fled the county, their plantations falling into ruin. Others used their wealth and influence to distance themselves from the scandal, professing shock and ignorance. The secret society, while not entirely destroyed, was broken, forced deeper into the shadows. Eliza's death was officially ruled an accident, the fire a tragic consequence of the chaos of her arrest. No one was ever held accountable for the murder of Jeremiah Hawthorne. The powerful have a way of ensuring that history records their preferred version of the truth. Abigail, freed from her mother's tyranny, was also left with nothing. The Hawthorne fortune was entangled in legal battles for years. Sick and heartbroken, she chose to leave Alabama, traveling north with Ezekiel Stone, who promised to see to her care. She and Caleb said their goodbyes on the dusty road leading away from the smoldering ruins of their former prison. They were husband and wife, brother and sister, fellow survivors of a horror that had no name. Their bond was absolute, but their paths now diverged. They had shared a nightmare, and now it was time for them to try and find their own separate dreams. And what of Caleb? He was a free man. He possessed a name, Caleb Hawthorne, a name he both claimed and despised. He had a small inheritance left to him in Jeremiah's will, enough to start a new life. But freedom, he quickly learned, was not a destination. It was a different kind of wilderness. He could have gone north, but he chose to stay. He felt a profound, unshakable connection to the land, to the people who had suffered alongside him. He used his inheritance to buy a small plot of land, not far from the ruins of the plantation. And he found Lila, the brave girl who had saved them all, who had been taken in by a community of free blacks near Mobile. Caleb brought her and her mother, whom he managed to track down and buy from her new owner, to live with him. He also found Jeremiah's journal, buried right where Lila had left it, by the roots of the old oak tree. He read it cover to cover, learning the full tragic story of the man who was his father. He learned of Jeremiah's tormented conscience, his secret donations to abolitionist causes, his failed attempts to dismantle the evil he had inherited. He came to understand that Jeremiah wasn't just a good master. He was a man trapped in a system, fighting a battle he could never win. Caleb spent the rest of his life fighting that same battle. He became a leader in his community, a quiet, dignified man who used his education and his resources to help others escape the shackles of slavery and poverty. He never spoke of Eliza, or the fire, or the dark secrets of the Crescent Order. He buried the past, but he never forgot its lessons. He knew that the seeds of that kind of evil, the hunger for power, the obsession with bloodlines, the willingness to sacrifice human beings for the sake of a legacy, were not unique to Alabama. They were planted in the very soil of human nature itself. Years later, After the Civil War had torn the nation apart and stitched it back together with bloody thread, a group of freedmen were clearing the land where the Hawthorne Plantation had once stood. They were digging the foundation for a new schoolhouse. Their shovels struck something hard. It was a small mahogany box, its silver fittings tarnished by fire and time. It was the baby's casket, the one that had been sent by the Crescent Order as a threat to Eliza. But when they opened it, they found it was not empty. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not the body of a child, but a collection of small, intricately carved wooden birds, dozens of them, each one unique. It was a secret stash, a collection Jeremiah must have hidden there long ago. Perhaps they were gifts he had carved for the son he could never acknowledge. Perhaps they were symbols of the freedom he craved but could never achieve. No one knew. The men, former slaves themselves, understood that some secrets are not meant to be deciphered. They reburied the box and built their school on top of it, a place of learning and hope built literally on the foundations of a forgotten mystery. The story of the obese widow, the enslaved son, and the forced marriage faded from memory, becoming just another ghost story whispered on dark nights, its terrible specific truths dissolving into the realm of myth. But myths are the memories of things too terrible to be history. They are the echoes of truth that refuse to die completely. And the echo of the Hawthorne Plantation is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of fantasy, but the men and women who will do anything to protect their power, their secrets, and their blood. This case was never just about one family in Alabama. It was a glimpse into the darkness that festers beneath the floorboards of power. The Crescent Order, or organizations like it, were not fiction. Throughout history, elites have always formed secret societies to preserve their control, using coded language, hidden rules, and rituals that defy the morality of the outside world. They create their own reality, one where human beings can be reduced to vessels or tools for the continuation of a bloodline. Think about it. This obsession with legacy, with pure blood, with ensuring a dynasty never ends, is it really a thing of the past, or does it just wear a different mask today? The names may change, but the hunger for a legacy that cheats death is a fundamental and dangerous part of the human psyche. Eliza Hawthorne was a monster, yes, but she was a monster created and enabled by a system, a secret consensus among the powerful that the rules did not apply to them. She was a symptom of a deeper disease, a rot that infects any society that values lineage over humanity and power over justice. But was everything truly revealed? What happened to the other members of the Crescent Order? Did their dark pacts and ghost blood arrangements simply continue in secret, adapting to the changing times? The records are silent. The history is buried. We are left only with the ashes of the Hawthorne Plantation and the chilling questions that rise from them like smoke. How many other secrets like this one remain hidden in the foundations of powerful families? Their legacies built on crimes that have been deliberately erased from history. The story of Caleb and Abigail is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But it is also a warning. The past is never truly dead. Its secrets are still with us, embedded in the very fabric of our society, waiting for a moment of chaos, a spark of rebellion, to come roaring back to life. What do you think really happened to the other families in the Crescent Order? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know. The order must be broken. If this chilling tale of secrets and survival gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history's shadows. Ring the bell so you never miss a video, and share this with someone who loves a good mystery. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.